Up next, Twinbrook, remembering our recent history. Stay with us. Welcome to Paths to the Present. I'm your host, Gail Street. Today we look at buildings from not so very long ago. However, despite their relative youth, they help us understand our past, our recent past actually. We begin with a segment on Peerless Rockville's effort to identify, inventory, and study the city's architecture from the last 50 years. Then we'll focus on a history of Twinbrook, a post-war community that helped change Rockville. But first, can you answer today's history quiz? This Colesville ranch was home to an acclaimed biologist and writer from 1956 to 1964. She wrote her most influential book here. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and was named one of Life magazine's 100 most important Americans of the 20th century. Because of her renown, this house was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1991. Think you know who lived here? Stay tuned. I'll give you the answer at the end of the show. So often when we refer to historic places, we're talking about sites that have been around for more than 100 years. It's easy to recognize the significance of a turn-of-the-century Victorian or an Art Deco theater. But did you ever stop to think that buildings constructed only a generation ago will be valuable to the future? Like clothes and cars, building styles change. What was once considered fashionable becomes dated. It's challenging to look at a structure from a generation ago and see its future value. Fortunately, we have architectural historians like Terry Lakeen at Peerless Rockville, who are identifying and studying the postmodern structures around town.
The general definition is a building that's less than 50 years old. That's been sort of the working definition. And these are buildings that have reached sort of an awkward middle age. They're too young to be considered venerable or historic, but they're too old to be considered daring or innovative or architecturally interesting. They're considered dated.
Buildings constructed in the 1950s and 60s are considered mid-century modern. They have their own unique style.
Modern buildings tend to be look relatively simple, although they are incredibly complex in reality. The beauty of the materials is allowed to be expressed in a modern building. Many modernist buildings are flat-roofed, and they have open, versatile interior plans. This is an architecture that derives its form from the functions for which the building is designed.
Montgomery County experienced significant expansion during that era. As a result, there are lots of examples.
St. Mary's Church on Beers Mill Road is a fine example of the modernist architecture of mid-century. Institutional buildings, there were a number of public libraries built during this period, one in Aspen Hill, others around the county. The Davis Library on Democracy Boulevard, I think, is one. The county office buildings that many of us have gone to at one time or another, Rockville City Hall, and of course commercial office buildings, shopping centers, strip malls, car dealerships. Evidence of this period is all over the region.
It's not uncommon for a generation to undervalue structures from the one before. The red brick courthouse, where Peerless Rockville is headquartered, is considered a landmark now, but that wasn't always the case.
In the 1960s, there was considerable pressure to tear it down and rebuild a brand new modernist courthouse. And fortunately, the American Institute of Architects and the Sentinel newspapers and other people advocated for the preservation of this building, and it's still here today.
With its recent past initiative, Peerless Rockville wants future generations to be able to appreciate this county's mid-century modern aesthetic.
We certainly don't advocate saving every building. That would be completely unrealistic. What we do advocate is to study and document what we have. There's an estimated 70% of what we see around us has been built since the post-war era. So these are buildings that need documentation and study, but also sometimes advocacy to help keep people redefining what the past really is. That something historic can happen today or yesterday and not simply 100 years ago.
Buildings that stand out as landmarks are easy to value, regardless of their age. For example, most agree the Watergate Hotel, built in the 60s, is important in American history. However, less prominent places can also help tell our mid-20th century story. Producer Barbara Grunbaum submitted this look at the Rockville neighborhood of Twinbrook.
In the wake of World War II, the city of Rockville experienced its biggest growth spurt to date. The Depression was over, the federal government was decentralizing, soldiers were returning home, and as Terry Lakeen of Peerless Rockville explains, the American dream to own a home of one's own was becoming a reality.
The federal government took the steps in the 1930s to create the Federal Housing Administration, which set standards both for mortgages and financing as well as for housing construction and housing sizes, set all kinds of standards. And then with a number of congressional acts after the war, the GI Bill, of course, which provided, among other things, jobs, education, and affordable home mortgages.
In 1946, 4 builders purchased Walnut Hill Farm, 202 acres south of the city. Their goal, to meet this new demand for housing. 2 years later, Frederick Bentley Jr., a World War II veteran, moved into this home with his wife. Georgia Bentley, now a widow, still lives here today.
The GI Bill made it possible for us to afford the payment on this house. I mean, God, it was only $43 a month. And of course, we didn't have any children, so that's how we could purchase it.
Many of the new residents were young veterans and their new wives. The neighborhood appealed to them.
In this section of Twinbrook, the streets were named after World War II battles and heroes: Admiral Halsey, Okinawa, Coral Sea, Ardennes, and other sites familiar to the veterans.
Built on the southern side of Veers Mill Road, these early homes were small in scale. They featured a living room, kitchen and eating area, 2 bedrooms and a bath. The attic and basement were left unfinished. The idea was that these homes could be expanded as the young families grew. And grow they did.
At one given time, you could count 30 kids out here in the court. They rode bikes and, just horsed around all the time and played in each other's yards. And of course, birthday parties and block parties were good. Everybody set up playpens, brought food, and we had a grand time.
By 1951, Joe Gerhardt and Donald Gingery had bought out their partners and expanded development to the north side of Veers Mill Road. This footage shows that land being prepped for the new houses. Ads like this illustrate the interiors. $1,300 bought you the house with only the first floor finished. Another $1,100 and you'd get a basement. $3,000 more added 2 bedrooms and a bath on the second floor. In September of 1965, Charles Jesperson and his wife moved in, along with their first child, with another on the way. They soon discovered they were not alone.
There were lots of babies, and the first week we were here, a man came in and they were doing a preschool survey, or it might have been the first month or two, and he was laughing because he'd been up on the next block and there were 72 preschool kids in 22 houses. That gives you some idea of the baby boom.
Schools were constructed to accommodate all the children. Carl Sandburg, Twinbrook, and Meadow Hall were the elementary schools. Broome Junior High and Rockville High served the older kids. With the new decade came a new look. Here in Twinbrook Forest, the housing styles were changing.
Well, the first thing you notice, I think, right away is that the homes are larger and they take up more of the lot size. But you also begin to notice the addition of carports, which of course indicates the increasing importance of the automobile in American culture. The other thing you notice is that the houses, in addition to being larger, are more architecturally complex, and you see what we now know as a split-level house. Gerhardt also started making more versatile floor plans, increased the number of bedrooms. Many of the homes now had dishwashers, which was a wonderful selling feature, I expect.
In the late 50s, retail came to Twinbrook. This footage shows the grand opening of the shopping center on the northern side. Vice President Hubert Humphrey joined local dignitaries in the celebrations, marking a new era for the citizens of Twinbrook.
And the shopping center just made things a lot more convenient for everyone because we no longer had to go all the way up to the middle of Rockville or over onto Rockville Pike where there were a few stores.
A real community was evolving here. The Twinbrook Citizens Association was formed in 1949 and has been active ever since. Through it, the residents brought a library to the area. For 12 years, it was located here in the lower level of the shopping center. Then, in 1971, a brand new one was dedicated.
They flocked to it. I mean, people lived at the library. It was close to home. Kids could walk down. Oh, and then they built a bike path, which made it more accessible for the kids to go on their own.
The civic-mindedness of these new Rockville residents spread beyond the neighborhood. After helping to form Citizens for Good Government, a newcomer and Twinbrook resident became mayor in 1954.
We elected a young man, Dick Hovsepian, who did the impossible. He lowered taxes and increased services and was an extremely efficient and good mayor.
To date, 6 mayors of Rockville came from the community of Twinbrook. One went on to be the county executive. Despite these positives, it's sobering to remember that Twinbrook began as a whites-only neighborhood and remained that way for nearly 20 years.
FHA standards, for one thing, stipulated that developers could not sell homes to non-whites, and the standards were based on the mistaken belief that people wouldn't get along in racially mixed neighborhoods. That prevailed until the 1960s with a series of successful court challenges and some federal legislation. But for at least the first 20 years, this was a whites-only neighborhood.
But times have changed. Today, Twinbrook is home to people of many cultures from all over the world. After more than 60 years, Georgia Bentley's neighborhood continues to be special because of one thing.
The people. The people make it special. They're just a good bunch of people. They're willing to help each other and look out for each other. And I'd say that means a lot, to know your neighbor. And that's what, to me, Twinbrook is.
So, did you figure out the answer to the history quiz? We asked what famous naturalists lived in this Colesville home. Rachel Carson lived here from 1956 until her death in 1964. This is where she wrote her most famous book, Silent Spring. It focused on the harmful effects of pesticides and is credited with the establishment of the EPA. Her mid-century modern home helps remind us of her ties to Montgomery County. Well, that's all the time we have for this show. If you have comments for us or ideas for future shows, send an email to paths.present@verizon.net. Be sure to tune in again next time as we follow more paths to the present. See you then.